Hello everybody. Welcome to Module 2.31 and we will get started here. Nothing fancy here. This is straight out of the book, and I realize that some of you might not have elected to get the textbook, so I believe this is important information and thus I present it. It's just one more building block in the structure we're building to successfully staff strategically. So after this brief lecture, you should be able to describe the workforce planning process, discuss how an organization can predict its future business activity, describe how an organization can forecast its demand for workers, explain how to forecast the likely supply of available workers from inside and outside of the firm, right? Discuss how to develop action plans to address gaps between labor and supply and demand, and describe the staffing planning process. So workforce planning, right? It's the availability of talent needed to execute a desired business strategy. And it's going to be influenced whether or not that strategy is ultimately successful is what we're looking at. Workforce planning then is the process of predicting an organization's future employment needs and the availability of current employees, right, and external hires. And note that we have those two sources to meet the employment needs and execute the organization's business strategy. It's the foundation, workforce planning, of strategic staffing. It identifies, addresses future challenges, and a firm's ability to get the right talent in the right place at the right time to execute that strategy. Right? So step by step, what is the business strategy? And that goes all the way back to the beginning of the course. Right? Articulate the firm's talent philosophy and its strategic staffing decisions. Are we looking to grow people? Are we looking to develop people? Are we looking for relatively short-term employees? Or are we looking for, well, you remember from that section, right? Conduct a workforce analysis to see, does our workforce then, in fact, meet our needs? Does it enhance or at least meet the basics of our strategy? And then from this you can develop action plans. So where do we go from here, right? The action plan should be consistent with the firm's talent philosophy, including the retention, the recruitment, the compensation, succession management. How do we groom people for higher level positions, and what are our training and development needs? Action plans can be short-term, they can be long-term, your choice. Monitor, evaluate, revise the forecasts and action plans. So it's about good record keeping, and I know that's like a mantra for this course, good record keeping, and high-level data analysis. So remember the talent philosophy? It's a system of beliefs about how people should be treated, and questions asked addressed by an organization's talent philosophy. Do we want people to contribute to the company over long-term careers, or do we want to focus on filling vacancies in the short term? And note that could be different for different positions within the same company. Do we value the ideas and contributions of people with diverse ideas and perspective? And then that, puts an emphasis on diversity in hiring. Do we see employees as assets to be managed or employees as investors? What are the ethical principles when it comes to our employees? So all of these factors, as we talked about in Module 1, come to bear in this decision-making process. So the workforce planning process then, we've got a very simple systems model here. You identify the firm's talent philosophies, you look at the business strategy, so from business strategy, and then you forecast the supply of labor available in the market and forecast the firm's demand for labor. So both of these keys, and note that ONET does give us some indication there as well. We could also be looking at colleges and what kind of degrees are being awarded, and what college students are looking to do can also let us know what future availability might look like for recruiting and applicants. Identify the gaps, projected labor surpluses or shortages, and it can work either way, right? Develop action plans to address the forecast talent gaps, and then monitor, evaluate, and revise the plan. So first, create a sourcing plan, right? Profile desirable employees to identify promising sources. Identify what desirable talent and successful current employees in target jobs like to do and how you might reach them if you were trying to recruit them now. So it's like almost setting up your recruitment strategy at sometimes before you actually are going to employ it, before you actually need it. You can use surveys, you can use focus groups. Ask where do they like to go, what media do they use, what organizations do they belong to, what events do they like to attend. No, this allows you to understand that these are the kind of people that I think I like, these are the people I want. Where am I likely to find these people? So you conduct focus groups with them to find out where they identify that they will be, right? How did they first learn about jobs in your firm? So that allows you to know what works and what doesn't. Right? What websites and other sources do they use? Again, where can we find the people we need when we determine that we need them? So this is kind of an extension of 2.3, if you will. And then create a sourcing plan. Where applicants discovered the vacancy, you're going to track this. You're going to keep the data. Where top candidates discovered the vacancy. And this is important. That is, top candidates, right, the best that we find, those that pass muster through our assessment process, where do they come from? And let's return to that area, right? How many recruits was generated at each source? What quality of recruits each source generated? What was the range of recruit quality from each source? So not only what is the average quality, but what is the range of quality, right? It may then pay to look at an area where we source less recruits, but in fact we're overall of a higher quality, less variability in those recruits. Or if we have a source that we want to use, but we see a high level of variability, then we might employ multiple kind of assessment processes to weed people out more quickly or efficiently. Right? What are the demographics? And this is important if diversity is an issue. What are the yield ratios? And we're going to talk about ratios to a greater and greater extent throughout here. Absence and turnover rates by source. Are some sources yielding less reliable employees? And if so, maybe we need to rethink using those sources. Job performance by source, promotion by source. Any data that we can gather that will facilitate our effectiveness in future recruitment efforts is welcome. Right? So, recruiting source effectiveness analysis. Well, here we go. Simple table, college, hiring. Average speed, how long does it take? 8 months. What's the cost per hire using that source? It was about $5,500. But what was the quality? Very high, right? So it's a trade-off again, and that's what data allows us to do, is allows us to make an informed choice based on costs and benefits, pros and cons, if you will. Employee referrals. Remember we talked about that in the last section, right? Average speed, this is much faster, and we had that table in the previous lecture that kind of gave us guidelines on how long things take. Cost per hire was higher though, $8,000, but the quality is high. So maybe this is a good way to go. Hey Quincy, how you doing? Do you think Annika wants you up there? Annika staked this place out, buddy. I don't know what to tell you. What do you think they're thinking? I don't know. I don't know if I want to know. Career sites, search firm, walk-ins, right? And newspaper ads. So again, it's to the record keeping. Now, let's look at what we might do, though, when we keep records. How might it inform us? Well, we can use this metric here. Assume you hire 2 new people for the same job and position. Which hiring process was more effective? So from the previous table, we have some information here, and we've added additional information. The time to fill, person A, 3 months, 5 months, person B. Cost to recruit was $6,500 for person A, $12,600 for person B, and the annual salary of person A was $97,000. For person B, $103,000. I think I want to get a job with this company, right? Considering they make about twice what I make. Forgive me while I drown my sorrows in a gulp of coffee. But, okay, so in this case, which hiring process was more effective? And you can say, well, shit, it looks like person A. All else being equal, that was probably a more effective process. It took less time, it cost less money, and we're paying out less in salary. But that's only half the story. What did we get out of the process? So then we might look at cost versus investment. What would your answer be with this additional information? And notice the first three lines are the same. Time to fill, cost to recruit, annual. But first year revenue generated by person A was $330,000, right? First year revenue for person B was $442,000, right? Second year revenue, $352,000. Look at the growth in revenue from person B though, $632,000. Turnover, person A left in 26 months. Well, person B hasn't left yet. High potential, not so much in person A, tremendous potential in person B. So we keep the data, we keep the numbers to inform us in the efficacy of our recruiting sources, right? And we think in terms of return on investment. Think about this. Ohio State can calculate the same thing, and they do to a certain extent. I remember one time I was told, Mark, you're one of the top 3 major converters in the psychology department. And I'm like, what the hell is a major converter? And it says, well, it's something we track that if someone who is undeclared or has a different major than psychology takes your class, then what's the likelihood that they will declare psychology as their major or switch their major to psychology? And I'm like, you track this? I can't even imagine how it's tracked, but obviously they have a way. But they've identified that 3 of us in the department convert more people to psychology major than anyone else in the department. Now I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. That's not what I'm saying. But it's part of what I bring then to the party, so to speak. So if you want to calculate, was I a good hire or not, what was the cost of hiring me? And actually at Ohio State, the cost of hiring me was frickin' nothing because I started teaching here as a graduate student. So really, technically you could say I wasn't even like hired. I just hung around longer than anybody else. Not so much. But then what do we generate? And there's a lot of things that we can generate. That is, statistics that we can generate. We can look at people who teach psychology courses and what does the enrollment look like. Now notice, this is conflated with the popularity of the course, right? Some courses are more popular than others. Certain classes are required for the major rather than others. But all else being equal, how many seats are sold might then be part of the return of investment on faculty hires, right? Grant money brought into the department for research, tenure track research employees, right? Grant money brought into the department. Number of graduate students trained and placed in R1 institutions. There's a zillion kind of pieces of information that we can look at that determine kind of the return on investment within any job. So, and management will often tell us what they believe to be important. Okay, so we understand the cost. We create a sourcing plan. Prioritize recruiting sources based on staffing goals and employee profiles. Prioritize recruiting sources based on the results of source effectiveness analysis, which we just took a look at. So if quality is the most important goal, college hiring would be the preferred source. If hiring speed is more important than quality, right, then employee referrals would be given priority to source the needed engineers, for example. So it just depends on what it is we're trying to do, but we got to be clear on what it is we're trying to do to get the ball rolling. So, forecasting. Well, given the uncertainty of forecast, it's best that we construct our forecasts in terms of ranges rather than specific numbers. And then with the ranges, we can provide low, probable, and high estimates, right? But ranges are better to work with and are going to be less misleading over the long run. And it allows us to develop contingencies. What if it comes out in the low range? What if it comes out in the mid-range? What if it comes out in the high range? Recalculate estimates as changes happen in the organization's internal, external environments, and as the firm's assumptions and expectations change. Okay? So, understanding the business that we're operating. An organization's product demand directly affects its need for labor. Locate reliable, high-quality information sources within and outside the organization to forecast business activity. Right? Types of business activity forecasts? Well, seasonal labor might make a difference. That is, we need more people during this season than not. Do interest rates affect our business and our hiring? Currency exchange rates, right? What about competitors? What about the industry and economic? What about others? And let's take, for example, the cannabis industry. We're 10 years into really at least 5 years into developing some robust cannabis industries. How do we forecast our needs as far as employment? What is the nature of employment, right? What does it look like? And note, there's a lot that is involved with this calculation. And first and foremost is probably what's legal in every state. Okay, and where the money is, right? And where the money is to be made within these organizations. And I think the cannabis industry is a good industry to look at in terms of this because it really generates a huge number of question marks. What does the customer base look like? How much cannabis will be consumed? How is it manufactured? How is it grown? How is it processed? How is it sold? This can vary from state to state, right? How many states? What does it look like? Pennsylvania just said today that there's bipartisan legislation. Let's get our cannabis industry off the ground in Pennsylvania. Why are they so eager to do this? Because New Jersey just legalized and New York is thought to be legalizing in any minute. And Pennsylvania, smack dab between the two, is saying, let us legalize this. Let's get on the bus. Let's start earning those let's pull in that tax money before people just go to New Jersey or New York. Right? So understanding your business environment becomes all important. Forecast labor demand then. It's a good idea to identify minimal as well as optimal staffing levels. What can we get by with, but what would we like to have, and develop a contingency plan for each, right? And this really depends on the forecasted business need. Achieving the staffing levels necessary for generating a given amount of revenue, right, within a particular period of time. When I was hired at the paper mill, what they did is they forecasted that the demand for copy paper would increase significantly. So while the Salem converting plant typically ran 3 shifts and took the weekends off, their forecast, and one of the reasons I was hired there, was because they believed that there was going to be sufficient demand for paper to in fact add a 4th shift. That is to increase production by 33%. It would be, taking it from 3 to 4 shifts. Fascinating about the paper industry was when the computers first were being developed and were going to hit homes and businesses, everyone said, well, the demand for paper is going to just drop off precipitously because people have computers. Right, and they will store everything on the computers, and they will store everything electronically. Lo and behold, how wrong that thought was. Initially, when computers, and you have to understand how people would use computers, which a lot of people didn't understand, is people are going to do shit on computers, but they're going to want to print everything out. So the demand, computers actually drove the demand for paper through the roof. No one anticipated. People thought, well, we'll store things electronically and we'll go paperless. No, it was exactly the opposite. People are going to want to print out everything they do, at least for this 10 or 15 year interim period. It's all going to be about paper. So note that copy paper has actually increased in demand rather than decreased as a result of the computer era. Who would have thought, right? So we have to understand then our business environment and what it looks like in the future. Now, let's talk a little bit about ratio analysis. And in Lecture 2.3, I talked a little bit about this. Let's get more specific about it. I just mentioned the yield recruits to applicants to hires, right? Well, ratio analysis assumes there's a relatively fixed ratio between the number of employees needed and certain business metrics. So, Using historical patterns, the firm can help establish, right, a reasonable range for these ratios, and again, we're going to talk in terms of ranges, can be used for either justifying new positions or demonstrating the need for layoffs, right? Need consistent historical trends to calculate ratios, and again, record keeping. But this record keeping often falls outside the human resources department and more in the realm of production and finance within the organization. So, possible ratios, production to employees. So Salem Converting says we're going to need to increase our paper output by 30% over the next 2 years. Well, what is the ratio of employee to ton of paper? And you work backwards. We're going to increase production by X number of tons, so that means that we're going to need X number of employees because we have this ratio that says an employee can generate X number of tons, right? The revenue per employee. So this might be more applicable to Salesforce, right? Managers to employees. And this ratio changes drastically, and in the era of downsizing, when we get into the 1980s and there was significant downsizing, what we see is a lot of the fat that was cut out or supposed to be cut out was management. We have too much management. We don't need one manager per 6 employees. We need to back that ratio maybe to one manager per 12 employees, if you will. So what is the ratio? What is the current ratio? And what do we predict is our target ratio? Inventory levels to employees is another one. Number of customers or customer orders to employees, right? Labor costs to all production costs, or the employee utilization of production capacity to employees. Now, coming to your second part of homework 8. What do we have here? I'd like you to go to ONET and just get a flavor for how we might begin to gather some data. And this is rather general, non-specific data. But for part 2, what I want you to do is fill out this table. So the career, is there a bright outlook, yes or no? Projected growth and projected job openings. So, if you want to use your career list, I don't really care what careers you use in this. You can use the job list as we've had, but please complete the 2 tables estimating the number of people in the following occupations for the following 3 countries. So, in this case, first what I want you to do is look at a career on ONET. Does it have a bright outlook, yes or no, right? And then, so you got to find all this data. Now it exists on ONET. You'll have to scroll down quite a bit because it's down below the KSAOs, right? ONET will tell you what is the projected growth for this occupation, percentage-wise, for 2019 to 2029 for the next 10 years. And what are then the projected number of job openings. So that's all this is just I just want you to go through this exercise to become increasingly familiar with ONET. So just fill out this table. Now, homework 8 part 3, please complete the 2 tables below, coming on the next slide, estimating number of people needed in the following occupations for the following 3 countries. So for medical doctor table, I've found a link that gives us the current ratios. You're going to need to find the population numbers and do the math. So I know, how lazy can I be, right? So for primary teacher table, you're going to need to fill out all the info. So do this table first, and what you can do is you can go to this website. This is from the World Health Organization, right? And there's the link, right? And it says, okay, so doctors per population. What I want you to do then is report from the WHO website, Australia, Russian Federation, and South Africa. What is the ratio? Then look up the current population, number now needed, projected population in 2029, and the future number of doctors needed. Right? This becomes all important, as far as medical profession. As a country, we really kind of need to understand, hey, this is what the number of people going into medical school looks like, right? How many doctors are we actually going to need? And do we need to do something to facilitate the entry into medical school, or do we not need to kind of put the brakes on it? So start here at this. Once you look at this, it'll start to make sense. Now, Then I want you to use your internet prowess to fill out the second table. Yep, you're going to need to look it up. Same three countries, Australia, Russian Federation, South Africa. What is the ratio, right, of students to teacher? What's the current population, the number now needed, the projected population in 2029, and the future number needed? Now, will you get these precise, and will I be looking at these as precise answers? No, probably not. But it gives you an opportunity to look at what presents or what could be ultimate trends in this regard. And often once we have this data, we might then put it as a scatter plot. This shows graphically, right, revenue and staffing levels are related. Okay, so in this case, what we're going to talk about is ambulance drivers serving a population. So the number of drivers is along the vertical axis. The population of the city, right, is along the horizontal axis. How many ambulance drivers do we need per number of people in the population? And then this allows us to potentially predict our staffing needs in the future. That is, if we know we're currently here, right? Let's say we have 30,000 people in our town, but our town is growing rapidly because of industries being built, and we currently have 6 ambulance drivers. If we project our population growth to go to, let's say, 45,000 people over the next 10 years, what should we be thinking about in terms of hiring, training, hiring ambulance drivers? What do we need to look at in that regard? So scatter plots are a great way to look at this. Note, I haven't asked you to do a scatter plot for this assignment. Now, trend analysis use past employment patterns to predict future needs. If a company's been growing 5% for the last 8 years, we might assume it's going to experience the same 5% annual growth, right? That might be the best prediction, all else being equal, with no other information. So we can begin to demonstrate trends that appear to be reliable over time, and then developing hiring plans and recruiting plans on the basis of those projected trends. Now, there's a lot of factors, right, that can affect staffing needs. It could be new competitors coming on. It could be changes in the economic environment, right? Changes in how the way the company gets work done. That is, automation might improve productivity. So trend analysis in itself is only a starting point. It needs to be augmented by other data. But it allows us to detect what looks possible, right? So here are the number of full-time nurses, right? Domestically educated or internationally educated. And in this case, we see a trend where we have increased internationally hiring nurses as opposed to domestically trained nurses. Okay? Yeah. This all involves collecting data, but the use of a certain level of judgment. And it relies on experience and insights of people in the organization to predict future needs. So, top-down, organizational leaders might rely on their experience and knowledge of the industry to make predictions about what future staff levels look like. Bottom-up uses the input of lower-level managers in estimating staffing requirements. And notice, both processes are likely to be used and can be used in a way that enhance each other. What's the big picture, but what's the on-the-ground story as well? Now, the role of judgment, because historical trends and relationships can change, it's best to supplement the more mechanical ratio, scatter plot, trend forecasting with managerial judgment. But notice I'm saying we augment. So we start with the data and then we layer judgment on top of it. The more mechanical methods can be used as a starting point, but then management, judgment, and experience can finish the process. So, return on investment is another component of this analysis, right? What does adding a new position do based on the costs and outcomes resulting from that new hire? So, one thing to consider is, would it be beneficial for Ohio State psychology to hire a lecturer who can bring 2 new courses to the psychology department. And you say, well, that would be good, because if we brought in 2 new courses, then in fact we're going to sell more seats, and that will be profitable for the for the department, right? Depending on what we're paying the professor. For example, well, let's back off on that for a minute, though, because we have to ask some questions. Well, if we bring in this new professor who's going to teach these 2 new classes every semester, and we believe those classes have the potential to attract, let's say, 100 students each semester, so that's 200 students, X number of tuition dollars. You see how we calculate the return on. But the problem is, will those attract essentially new students? Or are they just going to pull students from a pre-existing class to this new class with no increase in the return on investment? In fact, or now we're paying a second person, so it might in fact demonstrate the inverse of a return on investment. It might then demonstrate a loss. So compare the amount with the cost of adding in the new hire, compute the cost of hiring, including advertising the position, interviewing, screening, travel, relocation, training expenses, and add it to the compensation. Look at the what's going to be earned as a result of this process. So again, and sometimes the mechanics of this are beyond what human resources professionals are going to be involved in. They might supply the information to financial people who are going to ultimately make the decision. Now, how about forecasting the labor supply? Combining current staffing levels with anticipated staffing gains and losses, the estimate of the supply of labor for the target position at a certain point in the future. Anticipated gains, losses can be based on historic data, or combined with the managerial estimates of future changes. The external labor market is people who don't currently work for the company. The internal labor market is the existing employees. Right? So in forecasting labor market, this can be relatively complex, and again, probably beyond what most HR people are going to be doing. This is probably at a higher level that these decisions will be made than we will typically see. So estimate the competency level of the number of employees likely to be working for the company at the end of the forecasting period, and then forecast internal talent for the position. Subtract anticipated losses from people leaving, from terminating, from retiring, etc. And losses, so you can see anticipated gains could be from transfers, promotions. So when we're discussing internal talent, some people are going to promote, some people are going to leave, right? Some people are going to stay static, but looking at that internal market allows us to know how we might address additions from the external market. Now, transition analysis is a quantitative technique. It's used to analyze labor markets and forecast internal labor supply. It's simple, can be quite effective, right? Can be useful in answering recruits' questions about promotion paths. And if we have data, then if a recruit asks us, well, you know, I'm interested in long-term employment and promotion, career enhancement is important to me. What proportion of your employees promote to higher level positions, and how many promotions is typical for an employee's trajectory over a 20-year period with the firm, right? Well, if you have the data, then you can answer that question. That we tend to value promoting from within. We have a robust training program to move people along the ladder, so to speak, and this is part of our business philosophy, right? Now, it's best performed for a limited number of jobs because you want to keep it easily interpretable. But the transition analysis process then, okay, we have feeder positions, right? And we say, okay, the target position is the position we're interested in. What historically have been the positions people have held prior to entering into the target position? So this is kind of our focus down here, but looking at the target and then the promotions. Now, the target position that leads to promotions, okay, but We might see exits, that is, people just leave, they retire, or they in fact, go on to greener pastures, so to speak. We might have lateral moves that take place, and we've seen this at Ohio State right now with the implementation of Workday and this weird human resources software program that they're going to try and squeeze us all into. We lost our HR person in psychology. Psychology had its own HR person, Kim York, and she was the bomb, and it was fantastic. And she's taken a lateral transfer. She's moved into another position that's not related, right? So she's just gone, right? And now this Workday system is supposed to take her place, etc. We'll see how that works. But we see that she's transferred out. And then demotions. And that's probably pretty rare, especially considering that our required text for this class is the Peter Principle. I think you're going to find demotions to be quite rare in organizations, even if they should probably be made or required. So, judgment then. Judgment once again. Forecasting the internal labor market. One thing we can do is create talent inventories. I remember we did this at Columbus State, actually. That is, at some point in psychology, someone got the idea. Our new chair, Gary, I believe it was, said, we should see what everyone's talents are so we can best exploit, not the best word, but best exploit those talents and know what our capabilities, our future capabilities in the department actually are. So we, in fact, filled out talent inventories, and we described all the skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities we had, right, that we might be able to offer to the department. Also, replacement charts. This visually shows each of the possible successors for a job and summarizes their present performance, their promotion readiness, and development needs. And you can see with large organizations, this might become an extensive database. Employee surveys identify potential for increased turnover in the future. That is, employee surveys, if we're seeing increased levels of dissatisfaction with the workplace, then we might then predict more turnover, and we might need to bump up our recruiting needs or do something to change the reason that the turnover is likely to occur, although I wouldn't hold my breath on that approach. And then the labor supply chain management is the foundation of any supply chain to have the right product, the right volume, the right place, the right time, and the right quality. So looking at this as employees essentially as commodity, do we have what we'll need when we need it, and will they effectively be able to do the job? Okay. Note that supply chain management is about objects, but it can be readily morphed into an understanding of labor. So, the replacement chart, for example, VP of Human Resources. So, if the Vice President of Human Resources position opens up, who are our most likely candidates? Well, we've got Sam Jones, we've got Pat Wilstrom, and we've got Sally Posner, and here are the qualities that they bring and should help us determine who should be the promotion or perhaps who should not. Okay? So we develop these especially for key positions, and especially when we believe those positions may need to be filled in the future. Let's be ready for it. And also, we might then identify training needs once we've produced this in some of these people that they're good, they're probably the best overall given some training, right? So we can start building that into their career path. Now, forecasting the external labor market, monitor the external, first is through the observation and experience. This is the judgment call, right? The second way is monitoring labor market statistics generated by others, like the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And one thing, that is particularly worrisome about our job as lecturers here, right, is the forecasted external labor market is ever growing. I mean, when I first got here, 20 years ago I started teaching, and I would ask a simple question to my students, informally, right? How many of you are considering going to graduate school? And in a typical psychology class, I maybe get 1 or 2 people out of 60, maybe 5 out of 60 that are thinking about going to graduate school. And now when I ask that question, there's classes when I get a third to a half of the students raising their hand that they intend to go to graduate school. Well, okay, that's cool. I mean, I love education, but from the point of view of being a lecturer, that is, if half of y'all decide you want to go to graduate school, that is, there seems to be an ever-increasing number of people who may in fact be competing for teaching jobs. Even more so than research jobs, although research jobs are highly competitive as well. The labor market then, the external labor market is ever growing, right? And that could be worrisome because is this a hot prospect for a job? Well, on the one hand, if more and more people are going to graduate school, then it implies that we may need more teachers to teach them. But on the other hand, if they're going to flood the market and be willing to take teaching positions, and let's face it, if Ohio State pays a brand new instructor $6,000 a course, and they pay me $6,600 a course, all else being equal, wouldn't it be better to go with the younger people? I mean, if you can save $600 a course over how many courses are available at Ohio State, depending on, Ohio State's hiring philosophy, which is pretty much at a department level, this could be very threatening. So forecasting the external labor market. And then resolving labor, supply, demands, and gaps. So action plans, right? Proactively address anticipated surplus or shortages of employees. We use our best judgment, we use the data, and then we say, what are we going to do about it? And we develop not one plan, but a set of plans, right? If the labor market remains flat, then we're going to use this plan. If we see an increase, we're going to use this plan. That have multiple contingency plans. So, whether shortage or surplus of applicants is the result of temporary factors or reflects a trend likely to continue is what we have to consider. It's an important factor to understand because it changes our staffing strategies. Temporary talent shortages, right? Well, then we might use temporary workers. We might, often turn to expensive recruiting methods such as search firms or lower their hiring standards so more recruits are considered qualified, which is probably not the best practice, but might be a realistic kind of approach to a given situation. More expensive recruiting methods may quickly drain a recruiting budget, right? Without resulting in acceptable hires. So these are issues that you often have to consider in terms of trade-offs. So options include hiring incentives such as sign-on bonuses, okay, to attract more people in a tight labor market, or maybe retention bonuses such as stock options to be paid after the employee successfully worked for the company over a certain period of time. Okay. Now, some organizations present a persistent talent shortage. So this is where the worker shortage might last for a number of years, and then the organization is probably going to be forced to reduce its demand for the talents that are going to be in short supply. Maybe automation and technology is one way to get at this. Maybe redesigning jobs so fewer people with that talent are needed, right? Maybe it's an increase of the supply of qualifications it needs. Now, this is not a fast or practical solution, that last one. Also notice that at Ohio State, if there was a perceived teaching shortage, one thing that we could do is increase enrollment. Pretty simple, right? Rather than me teach, 5 sections of Psych of Emotion at 50 people a section, we're going to say, hey, we'll teach 2 sections over the course of a year, and we'll increase the enrollment cap to 160. Thus, it makes me more efficient, right? Now, that's not necessarily favorable or beneficial, and that gets back to the university's philosophy. At Columbus State, that is not likely to work, because Columbus State has a mission where they say explicitly, we're going to, the maximum number of students per class at Columbus State is 35. And that's that. And if we run into trouble, what we're going to do is we're going to add more sections, but we're not going to increase the enrollment. Whereas Ohio State has taken a different approach, right? Typically, courses that I began teaching at 60 enrollment cap are now at 160 enrollment cap. So it makes me more efficient, and it cuts the cost that Ohio State is incurring tremendously. Now, temporary employment surplus, if slowdowns are cyclical or happen frequently, temporary or contingent workers that don't get benefits, that we can just let them go at will, right? It can provide this buffer. Now, I've worked at 2 firms. When I worked at the lumber mill at Louisiana Pacific, and when I worked at the paper mill for Boise Cascade, they both basically ran what was layoff pools. So when business got slow, those who were hired in last, they got laid off first. And then you remain on layoff, and then they call you back as they need you. At Louisiana Pacific at the lumber mill, it really sucked, right? And it's an intentional act. What they do is they don't want to lose their trained workers. So you work, you're trained, right? And then they lay you off for a month and a half. And typically we get laid off, so sucked, right after Thanksgiving. And we get rehired sometime in January. So yeah, great to have Christmas off, except you got no money because you're living day to day anyway because of the shitty wages. But it was a rational strategy for them. It wasn't a kind strategy, but it was a rational strategy, and it kind of followed the building market. And that is, we produce lumber. And lumber construction in California really picks up at the end of January, beginning of February. So that's when we start, right, coming back to work and producing more lumber, right? So temporary layoffs that need to last more than 6 months to be cost effective due to severance costs, greater unemployment, insurance premiums, temporary productivity declines. But that's not always the case, and that's on a state-by-state basis. Alternatives to layoffs include across-the-board salary cuts or reduction of work hours for everyone, or relocating workers to expand other areas of business. And these are all relatively expensive propositions and can be devastating to employee morale. Now, if we engage in a situation, or if we enter into a situation where we have a permanent employee surplus, right, early retirement incentives might be one way to go. Layoffs, right, not filling vacated positions can reduce an employer's headcount, but there's a cost. Early retirement programs can result in most skilled, productive employees leaving the organization because they've got the greatest level of seniority, probably have the greatest level of experience, right? Layoffs can damage workforce morale, and I know it certainly did at the lumber mill. And not filling open positions can leave key positions in the organization vacant, understaffed, and then you hear so many companies say this, and it's such bullshit. Well, we're just going to have to do more with less. And it's said dismissively with the wave of the hand. And people at Ohio State have said this to us. We're just going to have to do more with less. Says who? Based on what? I mean, it's great to stand on high and make this pronouncement, but ultimately it falls down on the poor worker, and the lower you are, to the greater extent, right? So, action plans to address persistent employee surplus may involve reassignments, maybe a hiring freeze, steering employees away from careers that might generate future and greater numbers of layoffs. Retraining of employees to fill other jobs, that's one way to go, can help bring the labor force and balance, the labor force and the demand for labor into balance. But then you have to incur the cost of training. And that also assumes that existing employees are trainable to the new tasks, which may or may not be the case, right? So, the complex issues all around. Ultimately, though, it does appear that the employee usually suffers as a consequence of these decisions. So, 3 questions needed to be answered for staffing planning. How many people should we recruit? What resources do we need? And how much time will it take to hire? Now, these are the questions that you need to be able to answer as a human resources professional. So you're going to look at information for the first question of staffing yields and hiring yields. And that is, again, in terms of ratio. How many people do I hire based on how many applicants we've put through the process? What resources, right? So staffing efficiency forecasting and workload driven forecasting. What does the business look like in the future? How much time will it take to hire? Well, if we're recruiting continuously, if we have that type of organization, then we can become quite a bit more efficient. But if batch recruiting, we recruit a new applicant pool each time, is probably going to end up being more expensive. Now here is a question that probably you need to be able to answer. You're told we need to hire 75 people. Okay? Well, historically, if we've had to hire 75 people, how many offers did we make? And in this case, in this illustration, what we have is we were able to hire 75 when we made 100 offers. But 100 offers, we did 400 interviews. We did 500 interview invitations, 2,000 applicants. So this is the historic data that tells us, working backwards from this number, how many applicants we'll need to successfully achieve that number of hires. As long as we're maintaining the process in the same way and the standards are the same way. So that's one metric. That's something that you should be able to do in your position as a hiring professional, is say, hey, X number of applicants yields this number of hires. Now, the next really critical thing that shows that you know your job and you're able to be relied upon is the hiring timeline. So, in this case, what we have is the application process. We run for 14 days. Once we receive the applications, we move to a telephone assessment over a period of 7 days. Then, from that, it yields a smaller number whom go through interviews, right? 7 days. Job offer extended, we allow people 7 days to make up their mind. Then, the 7 days to extend the job offers, get that out the door. We allow people 14 days to decide whether they want the job or not. And then we begin the pre-job training. And that's going to be, so what we're able to do is, we're able to say, well, historically, if someone says, we need to hire 3 people, how soon can you have them? You say, well, what's the position? And this has been our hiring timeline in the past. So we're going to need about 7 weeks or more lead time to get you what you need, to get you trainable applicants. Okay? So 2 things you need to know. How many applicants do we need? And how long does it take to push applicants through our process? And there is a third component. Some of you are probably going, yeah, but that's not all. What the hell is it going to cost, right? And this is the external cost per hire, 6 basic elements that really produce 90% of the cost to hire. Our advertising expenses, what were they? Or agency and search firm fees, if we use that route. Employee referral bonuses. Recruiter and applicant travel costs, right? Back in the day, after I'd left as range master of the shooting range and I moved up to Northern California, I was up in Northern California and I got a call from Peterson Publications. They were producing Guns and Ammo magazine, and they said, would you be interested in applying for the position of editor, assistant editor in the magazine? And I said, you know, that would be interesting. And they said, okay, we'd like to fly you, we'd like you to have come down and have an interview. And so I'm up in Cloverdale, and they said, well, we'll fly you down. So they flew me down, right, for the day to engage in the interviews. So this is a cost, right? And they have to plan for that. And I will say this, I was embarrassed. It was the most horrible interview I had ever in my life. I don't know what possessed me. I was just horrible in the interview. I said nothing right. My attitude stunk. I don't know. It was embarrassing. I was embarrassed for myself after it was all over, how poorly I interviewed. And then I thought, you know, one of my friends suggested me for that position and had me come down for the interview, and how I must have embarrassed them. Horrible experience. Sometimes, guys, we don't do well. I mean, on occasion, we turn in an abysmally poor performance, and I guess the thing is, we dust ourselves off and we move on, huh? So, everything worked out just fine, so doesn't matter. Recruiter and applicant travel costs, right? Relocation costs. When I went from the Salem Mill at Boise Cascade to the Wallula Mill, that's from Salem, Oregon to Wallula, Washington, Eastern Washington, they paid for my move, right? That was part of the deal. I was moving to a higher level position, and they paid for the move. And they paid for my interim housing when I was in between Salem and Walla Walla. So, company recruiter costs, okay? You can see there's a lot of costs involved, and this is something you need. Now, internal cost to hire, internal advertising costs, you can see where these might be quite a bit lower, but not necessarily. Travel and interview costs, relocation costs, and internal recruiter costs. So, just get the idea that a budget is necessary, a budget is required. It's important to understand what this all costs. And then finally, geographic targeting. Sourcing recruits based on where they live. You can focus on a local labor market. I mean, if you're advertising for people to work at McDonald's, then you use local advertising sources, right? People are not going to travel to work at your McDonald's. They're not going to relocate to work at McDonald's, right? So, now, if it's a management position within McDonald's corporate, that might be a different story. But if we're looking at line workers, probably going to hire from the local force. For upper level positions, we can cast a wider geographical net. Right? So, lower level positions typically filled from the local labor market. That's about it for this. So you got a couple little short components for the homework assignment included in here. Again, we get back to this issue of record keeping. And this is it for Module 2. So we're going to move on to Module 3 coming up. I'll start taping those next week. And we got some new assignments. Module 3 is going to be more data-centric. So now we're going to start playing with numbers to a greater extent. And I hope that you like that idea. And I hope you guys have a great day. Bye-bye.